Welcome to Tigers and Teddies Live. It's our sort of fortnightly look at the content of this wonderful book, which actually weeks ago we launched, and this is the second edition of Tigers and Teddies, The Connected Baby Guide to Attachment. And here is the author. Good morning, Dr. Suzanne Zeedyk.
Good morning, Gary. It's lovely to see you this morning in a polka dot tie.
Well, absolutely. Well, I have to say, I got sent this during the week.
Wow.
From a regular viewer, and I thought it was a little bit snazzy for this morning. No detriment to Iain and Kevin, by the way, our guests. But I think when we start our second series of this, don't let the cat out of the bag. I'll wear this on that day. But
so did that come from Lily?
That came from the lovely Lily, and
hello, Lily.
I adore it. Thank you so much. It was great. And just feel free to send. I'll DM anybody my address if you want to send me bow ties. Anything at all. It'd be fantastic. So it's not a problem. So Suzanne, you're quite clearly not in your usual space. You're elsewhere, I take it.
Well, actually, Gary, it feels like I'm in my usual space because I've got this fancy background, which is my usual environment of my bookshelves and copies of Tigers and Teddies. But yes, I'm broadcasting today from a secret location where I'm just nipped away from the public in order to get a wee bit of headspace and enjoy the sunshine. And I thought it was a great opportunity to try one of these fancy backgrounds, which I hadn't done. And I have brought along a little tiddly teddy this morning for Tigers and Teddies. And I'm looking forward to welcoming our guests with their teddies too.
Great, Q. And our Dermot's here as well this morning.
Hello, Dermot.
So hi to everybody. I just had a message there. Gary, do you only wear pre-tied bow ties? Yeah. Yeah, I do. I can't fib to you. I've tried my best, but I'm not that classy, I'm afraid. Iain Smith, when you wear bow ties, are you a pre-tied or can you tie them? Are you a classy sort of chap?
James Bond, just leave it hanging the whole night and pretend I've been somewhere else before I arrive at a function. Not really a bow tie man.
I'm sure you've had your moments. Kevin, what about you? What's your dress of choice?
I try and avoid ties as best as possible. It's only if it's required.
I've got to say, Kevin, you're looking very relaxed and laid back this morning. It's really good to see you. Where are you joining us from, Kevin?
I'm joining you from my mother's living room because at my own home I've got two kids who wouldn't give me peace, so they'd be just jumping all over us and taking my teddies off me. Yeah. So it's nice to be here in my mum's living room.
Brilliant. Well, it's good to have you, Kevin. And Iain, what about you? Where are you joining us from this morning? And let's see the colour of your teddies, please.
I'm a singular teddy, but it was secreted a £20 note underneath it. I found it next door, so I'll be one of the kids. I've hidden money, but anyway, yeah, I'm joining from Balerno, just below the foothills of the Pentlands on a lovely day. So I'm glad to be here. So thanks for asking.
Oh, we're absolutely delighted to have you both. I think the sun's shining all over Scotland, and wherever you're joining us from this morning, I hope the sun's shining on you as well. Suzanne, Transforming Criminal Justice, major part of your book, the second edition. Why is this, once again, such an important topic?
Well, Gary, when you come to understand how much trauma is in the background of so many people that end up in prison, it starts to get you curious about where justice might not be served, about how we might be able to transform that system, about the amount of money that is spent, and about whether we might put money into prevention. I often talk about prisons as warehouses for traumatized people, because the proportion of people who come from a traumatized background who are in prison, it becomes quite shocking. And so really understanding trauma and attachment and relationships and ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, really gives us a new way to start to think about how we could serve justice and how we could serve our society. And that's why I was so pleased to include the stories of both Kevin and Iain in Tigers and Teddies, because it helps us to realize that there's really a kind of a hard edge, what some people see as a hard edge, to thinking about teddy bears and relationships. In other words, it's not soft, to really get your head around this information really takes us to some deep, deep places. And their stories really help us to get that.
So is there a push in Scotland in particular for courtrooms to become more compassionate?
There is. It goes all the way back to 2004 with the establishment of the Violence Reduction Unit with John Carnican and Karen McCluskey and their boss at Strathclyde Police, who gave them space and time to think about how we might begin to think about violence and crime in new ways. And that began to open up new conversations for our country to have. And most recently, there was a Panorama edition, which, in fact, Kevin took part in. We can hear from him about that in a moment, in which Kate Silverton was trying to help the rest of the UK and beyond to understand how we had really made changes to our criminal justice system in thinking about compassion, relationships, trauma. So on the one hand, I totally celebrate that. And on the other hand, I know we have a long way to go yet. So if we keep talking about this, it's the best way to make progress in helping to change minds and create more curiosity.
Iain Smith, you're a defence lawyer, and in the book, Suzanne written about your journey in depth. But the opening paragraph was that you had a light bulb moment in 2018. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so just before March 2018, I'd met a lady called Leslie Udwin in November, and she had created a charity called Think Equal, and it relates to early years social emotional learning, which I think is obviously at the heart of a lot of what the movement are doing in education. It just made me sort of start thinking more about the clients I was dealing with, the upbringings they had, and very quickly, because of Leslie's passion, she basically engaged me to meet numerous people, and she got to meet Karen McCluskey and John Carnican and various other people in effectively what is now viewed as the ACES movement. And I was really just hanging along with her. I was just really the introducer, and I ended up getting very interested. And in March 2018 at Wester Hales Community School, I met Tina Henry. Graham Goulding took me along to meet her, and I watched the film Resilience, and I immediately understood that I'd missed the science, that nobody had told me about it, that we weren't trained about trauma in law school, and that being a lawyer for 25 years absolutely missed this crucial science that I now in part understand through the help of Suzanne and other great guides, including Kevin and others. So yeah, it was a shock. It was a light bulb moment, but it was a shock to realise that what I was attributing to people about choice and a decision to take heroin or a decision to drink to excess or just being an angry person, that when you scratch the surface, it was shocking what was there. Yeah.
Kevin, if I can come to you, could you share with us your story of your early years?
Yeah, thanks, Gary. As in the book that Suzanne wrote, telling the story for me, it started off in childhood. When we talk about the biopsychosocial, which I totally get, the environment that we lived in through poverty, unemployment, being alcohol in the household, being, domestic abuse, growing up as a child, going to school, where I felt safe originally at school. When I lived in Glasgow, I felt it was good at school. But when I moved from Glasgow to West Lothian, that was, looking back, was traumatic for me because there was no sort of pre-warning. We just moved and then moved into a new school. So there was all these factors. I always talk about the sense of loss and my attachment to that school, my attachment to that school teacher who took me for shoes. I talk about, and then going to a new place and then trying to reconnect in a new community. And again, the same factors that was happening in Glasgow was still happening in West Lothian because it's like the early 80s and 70s going into the 80s. And and looking back, it was just, I feel a lot of stress in all communities and all families. So when I speak today, I speak for the many who experienced what I experienced as well, and that journey with struggling with relationships and struggling with school teachers and struggling all over to, going into my teenage years, and then even at the teenage years, I'm in prison. And so it's that journey, looking back, and where I see how the ACE study, how trauma affects this, how the body remembers, the mind might not remember, but the body remembers, and why I responded and acted the way I did. And I can see why many people who I always say who are not here today, and that's the only time I do wear a tie, Gary, when I'm tending funerals, but that's the reality, and that's life.
And you're the founder of Aid Abet that we'll talk about as the hour goes on. And Kevin, I thought your interview and the cameras that followed you around for the Panorama documentary, and I'm sure if people haven't seen it, they'll be able to catch it up on iPlayer or Simmer, I'm sure. I think it was a really, really powerful story. And I remember you helping one young man in particular, and trying to keep him on the straight and narrow. And we can talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But have things changed from when you were a teenager to where we are now? Is there more of an understanding? Is there more compassion in the criminal justice system, or is it still as it was when you were in court, many years ago?
Massive change in prisons, massive change in courts, only through people like Iain Smith who can speak up, and speak out and take risks. There's been change in schooling. I've seen some fantastic schoolwork getting done now. It's been great to be part of that, because I'm also involved in other projects where I go into schools and I see the absolute care and love for children that's going on. So, but there's more to be done. But I do absolutely see change. There's a thing that I always talk about. Is when I first went to prison and home young offenders back in the day, it's been a total change in there, as even in the building, how you live in there. There's education within the prison now. The food you get is better. The conditions you live in is better. The care you get is better. See, what's happened is, I feel, is prisons have evolved and trying to keep up with the times. And that side of the wall, but on this side of the wall, in the communities, haven't changed. I go into some areas in Scotland today, I'm not going to mention, but I describe it as I can chap a door, when the door opens, I see 1973. And some of these places are still, so there's a lot still to be done in Scotland, and there's a lot of poverty still going on in Scotland. A lot of people living in 1973. I use that because for some reason it reminds me back in 1973. But things have changed, Gary.
Yeah. And when you were there, because we have spoken previously, and also it's in the book, you talked about when you were caught up in that circle of crime, or when you were really, really stressed. Actually, going to prison was almost like and I'm not putting words in your mouth here, so please keep me right, was almost like a de-stressor, because all your meals were there. You didn't have to worry about work. You didn't have to worry about all the day-to-day domestic stuff. So do people who experience prison, do they tend to get, this is a really terrible way to put this, Matt, I think, but do they tend to get used to it?
Not a terrible way to put it, Gary. It's the truth. To get used to it. When I don't say it as a joke or how it genuinely happened, but I went in 2001, I went to Edinburgh prison, and they still had the old A-hall, so I still went into a cell with a jaggy blanket, a piss pot, I'm just going to say it like that. That's what I had. I didn't have a toilet or anything like that, just a jaggy blankets, hole in the window, so that's what I was expecting to go back to. And 6 years later, I go back to another prison sentence, and when I go in, the halls are different. They open the door, and I see a kettle, I see a quilt cover, I see a unit, I see a toilet, and I genuinely say to the prison officer, I want to get a phone call. And that was a bit of tongue in cheek, because I said I wanted to phone my lawyer, and he's like, I said, because I'm staying, because I'm living in better conditions now than what I've been living it there. And through time, I always say a prison sentence is 7 days. 7 days to get used to what's happening from Monday to Monday, like that for a week. And once you know that, for me personally, it reduced stress. I didn't need to worry. I knew my healthcare was there. I had a roof over my head. And it's quite tragic to say that, but I still work with guys today who will come out of prison because they want to connect with their family. It's not the fact that the prison lifestyle is they're missing their family, missing their wife or their kids, or missing their connection. And then when they come out, they realise the stress of living in society again, that they go back and say, no, I'm better off in the jail. That shouldn't be said today. It shouldn't be said, you know.
Can I come in there, Gary? So Kevin's story helps us to think about trauma. So I described prison just a little bit earlier as a warehouse for traumatized people. That means that that a very large proportion of people who end up in prison carry these really high levels of stress that Kevin is talking about. And that means that they have acquired that from the life that they have been living, and very often from the lives they were asked to live as children. So when you come into a structured place where things are predictable and you know it's going to be warm enough and you know you're going to have 3 meals, actually that creates a level of safety that some people have never known. And if we take time to think about that, which is why I'm leaving lots of spaces even between my sentences now, so that we can think about a prison is a more predictable, stress-free place than real life, you know, or than life outside. I think that gives us time and leave to pause. Because here's the one other thing that Kevin's story helps us to think about. And then we can ask Iain, why is it this way? Okay. Kevin just said, I came into a cell with a jaggy blanket and a piss pot. That must mean that we think that people who end up in prison are only deserving of jaggy blankets and piss pots. In other words, if we think blame, and I understand that people who have gone to prison have done something that is hurtful, causes pain to other people, causes the taxpayer money. But if we think that blame is the solution and that punishment is going to change things, we kid ourselves. So it lets us ask, where did we get the idea that blame was going to fix it? If what we want to do is to tell people that what they are deserving of is a jaggy blanket, which is actually a lot of what they have experienced through their whole life, we will not prevent anything. We'll just keep this cycle going round and round and round. We'll spend taxpayers' money paying for that. Part of the point of today, and these stories are to help us to think, how do we prevent this? Instead of how do we keep funding it, and how do we keep punishing people? How do we help to create a system that steps beyond punishment and actually prevents crime and violence? And we need to go all the way back to childhood to think about that. That's the power of these stories.
Iain, if I could come back to you for just a moment, I've got numerous questions I want to ask, because I imagine that you've been at the real sharp end in terms of trying to change hearts and minds within the criminal justice system. But let's go back to when you had that light bulb moment in 2018. How did the way that you practice law change?
So it's been gradual in terms of the things that I'm doing. So I don't always get it right, even now being better educated. I explained a little story just before we came on air about, you know, I have my own failings as a parent as well, but and they're sharply focused because of the teachings about attachment and realizing I've got to do all the right things rather than preach what judges should do or other lawyers should do. So the immediate effect it had on me was to immediately realize about how I looked at my clients. So I can't remember who the quote comes from. Suzanne will probably know. But I think the quote was, if you look at the child differently, you'll see a different child. And I started looking at my clients differently and seeing people rather than the phrase that we use as lawyers as punters. And the reason we do that is we detach ourselves from our clients because we think that's the professional thing to do. So we don't really want to know their sad stories about them being sexually abused. We'll put that in a plea, but really we don't want it to affect us, because that's not very professional. If you become connected to your client in some ways, and I don't mean you take on their emotional baggage, or you think that you can fix them, or any of these things. But for me, it changed how I spoke to my clients. But immediately, because I changed, they spoke to me differently. And that would be the theme, I guess, overall, I would say, in the justice system is the professionals, the judges, the police, the educators, the solicitors, social workers, we're the ones that have got to change. And then once we change, the effect that has is enormous. So I'd say that the most fundamental thing is I changed how I spoke to my clients, how I viewed my clients. There's been numerous other changes, but that would be the single biggest thing. And the response to that is enormous. I was dealing with boys 2 years ago who were social workers. I explained what I was doing in terms of giving them a bit of help and doing a little bit more than I'd normally do as a lawyer. And they scoffed at me to say, "You are wasting your time with that boy." And that was someone in the criminal justice social work department, the very people who should know best. And they scoffed at me because they thought I was wasting my time. And that's not to say this boy is now perfect. The difference in this boy is massive. And he engages, and his social worker who now deals with him, she engages with him, and they talk about the massive change. Now, I'm not saying I'm responsible for that change. I'm just saying, but I know I've helped him change by me changing.
And Kevin, Iain's talking about transformative change in individuals. With your experience and with your charity Aid Abet, do you find that taking this approach transforms individuals as well?
Yeah, I think that we talk about informed, and some of the people we work alongside, and the job that I do today, with Aid Abet, and most of my work is on prevention, and to prevent young people going further into the system of criminal justice and substance misuse or what other behaviours, extreme behaviours, which is it's affecting their lives. And so when we talk about trauma informed, and again, we're using an information to carry to young people, who then see a way that they are better, they are good, they don't need to offend. I have to give the information and understand that what Iain spoke about there. Some young people feel that they've not got a chance in life, and how they've been conditioned, how they've been treated, how they've been hurt. When they had a teddy bear for comfort and safety, the blanket for comfort and safety, then they need to protect themselves with a blade and baseball bat. The teddy becomes a weapon of safety because of the fear and trauma and whatever's happening in the communities. So when we can get them to put down the blade and pick up the teddy, again, as in like care, when I talk about love's a demonstration of action, and we show that demonstration of action of care and compassion towards another human being and giving them hope, which then shows that they don't need to go to prison. Some may make mistakes and go to prison and realise, and then they change. So it's a collective approach from everyone. But when I'm working in my field, I need to. My objective is to prevent them going back to prison. They have to be. Sorry for the phones ringing there. So what I'm saying is, how we inform people and how we let young people know where they are in life and change is possible. That's what's happening. But I still believe it should be even further back into schools.
I mean, do we need to become a more compassionate society for this to work? So if you've experienced crime, what both you and Iain are saying could be very difficult to swallow, very difficult to listen to. And you hear that, well, people, commit crimes, and then people will say, well, lock them up and throw away the key. And there's no compassion in that whatsoever. Do we need to have more of an understanding as a society? And how do you tackle the comments that people who've experienced crime that will be anti everything that you and Iain are standing for at this moment in time?
Gary, people should be accountable for their actions. Let's get that right away. That's fact. It's why the actions that they committed. What led them to that? When young people's dreams and aspirations are smashed, and they don't see a future. Every human being wants to achieve something, to be something in life. And if they've been let down in school, let down in their home, let down they will go and find something else which leads, and it's usually crime. Not everybody who is in the criminal justice system has came to trauma. You know, there's people who choose, career criminals choose to go into crime who never came to trauma, like, you know, fraudulent stuff. There's various other crimes, it's no. But when you're looking at the behaviour of young people, and like stealing to get money to feed an addiction, and when you look more into why the addiction, what they soothe, and you know, we talk about all that. Young people have been felt let down, young females who need to fund their way through prostitution, who are led into it because they're led into that way. Prostitution is not a crime as such, and what I'm trying to say is, you look at different levels of behaviour, it's because if you look back, they've been let down way at childhood, you know, in society, in the community. Now, you know, victims of crime. I'm a victim of crime. Most people are victims of crime, and that's not about. And I'm the perpetrator of crime. I get that, you know, but it could have been prevented, you know, and it could have been prevented through more education, through more loving care. You know, it all has to start at childhood, you know, and if it doesn't, it will fold into behaviour. And it's not about saying, oh, it's a shame for that wee guy. I'm trying to support this wee guy because he went through this traumatic experience, and he shouldn't go to jail. You know what I mean? He's got to be accountable, and if a judge sees that's the way. But see, when he comes out of jail, you don't want him to go back. You know what I mean?
Can I come in there to just like put stars over what Kevin just said? Because one of the worries is that when you start to talk about compassion in relation to criminal justice, somehow people can hear that as that means we're going to leave people unaccountable for their actions. And that's a fundamental mistake of understanding the kind of discussion we're trying to have this morning. It's not okay to commit violence against other people. It's not okay to be unkind, if we want to use that language. Bringing a compassionate view and a curiosity about a trauma history is not saying that you get away with anything. It's saying that we can't have prevention unless we understand that history. So if you want to put that in a, you know, in a sharp way to help us to get it, do we want blame or do we want prevention? Do we want to punish people or do we want to stop the kinds of pain that is involved in violence and crime? Shifting from a focus on blame and punishment lets us start to see where some of the sources of this behavior are. And it's really easy to resort to blame. I've been seeing that in some of the chat here. So Pauline has said it's easier to turn to blame. Yeah, because that makes us feel better in the moment, but it doesn't stop the kinds of behaviors that bring so much pain. So key things to understand from this, I think, are, one is that we're not saying you get to do anything you like and that there are consequences. It's saying, how do we bring compassion alongside boundaries and consequences so that people can begin to heal rather than just continuing this cycle? And I think that that's one of the key elements to get across to other people, is that it doesn't mean you get off with crime. It means that you find people, you help people actually to step into taking responsibility for what they've done.
Iain.
So just on the back of that, I mean, for victims, my what are called pleas of mitigation in court, what I'm explaining to the judge about their background, if it is relevant. So if adverse childhood experiences are relevant for my client, then what I'm doing an explanation rather than excusing their behaviour, and there is a critical difference in that. So I'm not saying it's okay for people with childhood trauma to commit crime. So that's where I think I would diverge from what I think some of the criticism of me is, that I'm not saying it's okay. It definitely isn't. But the concept of what's called, Karen McCluskey calls smart justice, is really is a counterintuitive thing for judges, counterintuitive for lawyers and everyone else, because at the moment there's a desire and design to punish people that this is a blame game that we're doing. And if your goal is to punish, then we're doing very well at it, because we have got the highest prison population in Europe per capita. Does it work? It definitely doesn't. All it does is it makes people's hard lives, and these are the people I'm talking about, struggles, not the career criminals that Kevin talks about that choose to exploit people. I'm talking about people who are damaged in society. Their hard lives become harder. They're taking off their benefits, they're put into custody, the family breaks down, and it's just self-perpetuating. It's a cycle. What we want to do, if we want to fix the problem, is we actually need to focus on what's underneath the bad behaviour. And it's this what's happened to you idea. So if we're focusing on the person being bad, that's the wrong approach. The approach is, what is that bad behaviour telling us? And it's the same for nursery workers, for school teachers. It's the same theme, which is what's underneath their bad behaviour. And if we can understand that in the trauma-informed approach, then we'll reduce crime. Because what I think we'll then do is look at clever ways to help people rather than punish them. And again, the victims might say, we don't want to help people, but actually, if they're victims themselves with compassion, they won't want anyone going forward to be hurt, because we want it to stop. And from my point of view, I make money out of misery, and I can't do that anymore, in the sense of I don't want the young people coming through my door to continue to commit crime, because I know what's underneath their crime. And I think if we get our heads around that, that for me is smart justice, is long-term fixing or helping, rather than perpetuating damage. That's, and I think even in a victim-led justice system, that's still critical.
In fact, okay, so if you move on from what Iain just said, what you realize is that we as citizens have been cheated, right? We have been led to believe, and we have bought into the idea that a prison system that just punishes people is good enough, that that's worth spending our money on, that we're happy with a revolving door, that we don't want smart justice. And I'm letting my tone get carried away, because I think that is appropriate. We have been misled into thinking that that is good enough, that blame will do us. And Iain just helped us to realize that's not smart justice. We hurt ourselves, and we hurt other people, and we waste lives. So if we can do a flip in our thinking, and we can bring in some more compassion and curiosity, and the courage that it takes to see stories of pain, then we can actually have smart justice. We could spend our taxes on other things. So if we move from a place of defense about, oh, we're going to let that person off, to actually, I have been cheated as a citizen of smart justice and smart spending of tax money, you actually have a totally different perspective on this. We should be demanding this rather than surprised by it. And the fact that we're having a discussion about this morning, and this just isn't normal, and this just isn't the way that our justice system works, let's just start to go, where did we miss that? Why is this not just normal? Why does this sound radical and edgy? Why is this just not normal? That becomes a really interesting question to ask.
Here's a radical thought.
Yep.
We're about to spend around 600 million building a super prison, I think, to replace Barlinnie, and yet only 60 million invested to assist with reform and rehabilitation. Imagine just switching that round and the gain that you would have of helping people get out the system that they're in, rather than with the expectation we're going to fill the prison even further. I think that's what we need to do.
So Iain, and you've preempted my question there, my next question. So the maths makes sense in that example that you've just given. So how do we persuade, or indeed is our job to persuade the powers that be to do that, to reverse funding? You know, how do we do that? How do we get governments to make those sort of decisions?
So I would say the difficulty for all governments are that we have the majority of the people want retribution. They don't want compassion, because they would see that as soft justice. So I think what we've fundamentally got to do is train people, educate people about trauma, about what is going on in people's lives. So for example, in court at the moment, we have drugs courts, and the judges are a bit more trained, and they're looking at the problem being drugs or alcohol. The problem is not drugs or alcohol. The drugs or alcohol, Kevin describes it, that's the solution to their problem. Their problem is underneath that, which is their trauma. The judges don't understand that, then it's not going to work. The difficulty for politicians in investing in what we're talking about is they're going to have a whole swathe of people who vote them in, because that's the most important thing for them when they're in power. They want to stay in power, and to do otherwise may be seen as soft justice. Now, that said, and I'm more a socialist than anything else, but I think a lot of the work that the SNP are doing just now is very admirable. I think they're trying to do the right things. They completely get the trauma. They've invested lots of money in education and health and in the justice system. But I don't think it's a vote winner for them. So that's the tricky part. So I think we really need to educate the public about why it's sensible, why the investment is long-term gain rather than short-term gain, putting people in jail. And as I say, I think it's a political hobby. That's why they will not all shout about it.
So,
and that's why, Gary, that's why the ACEs movement is so important. That's why every single person attending this morning matters. Because it's people talking to other people on social media, around kitchen tables, out on your daily walk, helping people to think through, where does compassion come from? How do you give up blame? What's the impact of trauma? What money are we spending? Those conversations matter. And Scotland has embarked on this ACEs journey. Not everybody is sure about that frame. There's lots of debate about it, but I welcome that debate, because until ACEs arrived, we weren't having this debate. And we need this debate, because otherwise we're not going to get the kind of shift that Iain and Kevin are talking about. I think we deserve it. I think our children deserve it. And I think it's driving that conversation that will make it happen. Because if the politicians have to drive it and it's not a vote winner, then the bottom line is we are the problem. Culture is the problem. Let's stop being the problem and figure out how to help more people to shift that mindset.
Kevin, let's stay with telling the story. So obviously, BBC's Panorama, Kate Silverton, produced the documentary recently about the impact of the VRU, in particular, in Scotland. And what would you like the impact of that half hour of very special television to be on the rest of the country? Because you were very honest and very open in that documentary. What would you hope is the outcome, or part of the outcome? Or the contribution to the conversation from the documentary?
Yeah, it was actually, it'd been better if the documentary was a wee bit longer, because there was a lot of contributors to that documentary. That documentary came about because of Iain Smith and his contacts, and as Suzanne said there, it's about how we all talk to each other, how we all come together. But the impact I feel that it has is it's demonstrated what Scotland's doing. It showed the love and care. I mean, I even get a wee bit emotional when I talk about the school kids in that documentary in Drumchapel, when the wee boys saying it's complicated, showing the teachers love and care for them when she says it's okay, she didn't, get out. I mean, but if that was me going to school saying it was complicated, I'd just be chased. I wouldn't even go into the school back in the day. This is the change that Scotland's having. I think what the documentary demonstrated is here's what Scotland's doing. We're not saying it's perfect. What the Violence Reduction Unit has done with the public health approach to it and seen it as an illness is a great way for us all to work together. We can talk about cost. We can talk about the cost of the criminal justice system. We can talk about the cost of what it costs to lock people up. We can do all that. We're missing the health side of it, which the navigators showed what they're doing there. We want to prevent people going into A&E. Because that costs money. We want to prevent people going into jail. We want to prevent people going through pain and misery. We want to prevent people going into addiction. We want to prevent. So I think the documentary impacted that Scotland's doing something, and we need to keep going with it. And we need more voices. I just felt that the documentary could have been a wee bit and showed other projects, and because there's a lot going on, an awful lot going on in Scotland. and a lot of people are doing. But you know, it happens through connection and conversations like this. You know, and we keep this drive and we keep going forward. And I'm just blessed to be part of it. And going back to the ACE study, and if it wasn't for that, I'd still be going about still wondering why did they, you know, because we've got information, because we start then getting curious and looking into the ACE study, and I went a bit more curious again and started looking into other people such as Bessel van der Kolk and the body keeps a score stuff, and I start to identify all that stuff, and I start to get curious, and it all makes sense. But everything seems to come down for me, and what the documentary was showing is if we showed a care and compassionate approach in education, in hospitals, within the justice system, and it is smart justice, as I say, but it's about us all having that. You know, so I feel that's the impact that document has put across, Gary, showing us a nation coming together, regardless to your views on what other political parties or whatever, we come together as a one nation. You know,
Was when you discovered ACEs, was that a particular turning point for you? Because I'm also keen to find out how you turned your life around and then formed Aid Abet.
Gary, I was talking about ACEs for years, but didn't know it was ACEs, right? So it gave me a title to go, I get it. I've now got a label, and I know we don't like to talk about labels. I'm sure it gave me an understanding. I've been wanting to change my life for years, didn't know how to, and it was only through the actions. There's many things, I've not got time to go through it, but let me tell you, there was many vital points in my life where people showed, and it was compassion, care, kindness, and love. One was a prison officer, one was a former drug addict, one was a librarian. It wasn't for it. There's a librarian out there today who had never showed me that care and compassion, and I had to find that book, Feel the Fear, Do It Anyway. If I never had, there's certain people in my life who showed me care and compassion and kindness on my journey to get me into turning my life around. About it wasn't. I don't take the credit for it. People say, "Oh, you've done great, Kev, turning your life around." But so many people in my life who I'm so thankful for today. Some people don't even know they were helpful to me, and what they've done and their kindness. So that was the part, and as we keep saying, it's about compassion and kindness.
Suzanne, isn't that a really interesting point that Kevin makes about that? About, you know, you don't sometimes realize the impact that you have on somebody's life.
Well, one of the things about kindness, Gary, is that we somehow tend to see it as soft, we see it as light, we see it as fluffy, a bit like teddy bears. And yet Kevin just told us a story about how kindness helped to change his life. A librarian, they don't sound like very serious people. Let's talk about criminal justice. Kevin just told us that a librarian helped to change his life because she or he recommended the book by Susan Jeffers, Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. We often don't know the impact of our actions, both for good or for ill. So we can also do things that are well-intentioned that can have harmful consequences as well. So I just think if we can stay curious and aware of the power of connection and value responses that are affirming and create a sense of safety, we start to realize that a lot of this change comes in little tiny moments. They're not in gigantic big fixes. They're in acts of kindness and stability and growing a sense of trust in other people. And our question here today is, how do you help people to realize that, and how do you bring it to systems? And so one of the questions that I'm seeing coming up in the chat is to Iain. Iain, somebody's asking, how many other lawyers now practice in the way that you do, who practice with attention to compassion and kindness? And is there any, is there training increasing for legal training in this? Or are you and Kevin still really at, the edge of a vanguard that hasn't arrived yet?
So I think to become a criminal defence lawyer, I think you do that because you're interested in people. I think the vast majority of us that are criminal lawyers don't do it from a position of wanting huge sums of money, because it's certainly not the biggest earner. The Legal Aid Board still pay, I think, roughly about the rates we were paid in the 90s, which is around £40 an hour. So being a criminal lawyer, if you're lucky and you're busy, I mean, we're quite busy, so I'm not claiming poverty. I earn a good living from my job, but you don't go into being a criminal lawyer for anything other than you want to help people, I think. So that the compassion's already there. What isn't there is the science and the knowledge. And I think because that's lacking, people probably don't respond in the way that I've been doing. Now, you and I have written articles for the Law Society Journal. We brought the judges over from America, and numerous things about banging on about trauma-informed approaches. So I'm doing that. It goes out to 11,000 lawyers. I thought, oh, everyone will get it, but of course they don't get it because there can be a reluctance to it. There can be a thought that it's wishy-washy, it's soft. So there's a lot of people still to convince. In my own court in Livingston and elsewhere, I now hear the younger lawyers talk about adverse childhood experiences. I now read in social work reports about childhood trauma and the social workers being brave enough to say to the judge, this is likely to have come about, this offending behaviour is likely to come about as a result of poor self-regulation caused by childhood trauma. And this is a new thing. So I'm not saying I've brought that in, but I'm just saying I've noticed that this is a change. So that's a good thing. From a training point of view, obviously we've been doing lots of talks about it. Kevin and I are part of the West Lothian ACES Hub. We've been going around schools and hospitals and GP practices and the police and community groups talking about trauma-informed. But the Law Society have decided to create a trauma-informed training online, I think probably because of COVID. But it's online, so a lot of the materials are online to tell lawyers, both criminal lawyers and civil lawyers, about trauma, because they need to know it not only for their own clients, they need to know about it for themselves, because lawyers are not immune to childhood trauma, and for their staff. So if you understand that, you can become a better employer as well as a better lawyer. And again, poverty is at the heart of a lot of it, but you've got people like Tony Gamage, who's with us today. It tells a great tale about childhood trauma which is inflicted accidentally. So I think we've got to make sure it doesn't become a them and us. This is all about us and us as a community and how we can help each other.
And in terms of the judges, are they responding to these reports and to references around ACEs and trauma? Are they getting there quickly? Is it slowly? Do they get, if you get somebody who doesn't necessarily respond to smart justice, how many options will they give them before they will eventually put them into prison?
Right. So judges, by and large, are middle class males. So the vast majority of judges are in that category. The Judicial Appointments Board, I think, are evening that up. So a lot of appointments, thankfully, are bringing female judges, judges from the BAME community, and we now have a mix of judges from different socio-economic backgrounds, which I think is a very good thing. So there's a bit of a barrier because the traditional judges are steeped in a tradition of punishing people, retribution. I've told you you've not to do this, you've done it, therefore you're going to jail. And that's a wee bit like parenting. I've told you not to do that, I'm going to give you this punishment, not realizing actually that it's not going to solve anything. So I think sometimes judges sit very high up. I mean, physically, judges sit above people and they look down, and I've concluded that often they don't see the people that they're dealing with. So therefore, the ACES movement is having a slow trickle effect, but it is definitely having an effect. Suzanne and I and Kevin and others, we've met the Judicial Institute. They're responsible for training all judges in Scotland. And we've brought in a thought, so I've used the word, not to annoy them, but to make them look up, is about presiding with kindness. Now, I don't expect a judge dealing with a young person who's stabbing someone or who's taking drugs to be kind in the way that we all know that the word, but to be empathetic, to understand what's going on and to figure out ways long term to stop it. So there's concepts of that. I'll give you a very brief example. I appeared in Edinburgh Sheriff Court for a lad that Kevin and Aid Abet helped. We'll call him Brendan, that's not his name, but Brendan had terrible abuse in his young life. He was introduced to heroin by his mother. at 13. Horrific neglect, abuse by probably adult male partners, both physical and possibly otherwise. And he failed in his progress in a community order. So the judge has given him a chance not to go to the jail. I'll give you a community order instead. And I'm appearing with him, he having failed that because he became homeless, became addicted to drugs, and was failing the system. And the judge, rather unwisely, asked me an open question, which was, what do you want me to do with him? Now, I had just told her that he'd met and engaged with Aid Abet. He'd engaged with the Rock Trust. He'd sorted housing for himself. He got himself a doctor through Aid Abet and was on a prescription. So he did all these things himself, albeit he had failed in his progress and community payback. And the judge said, what do you want me to do with him? And I said, I want you to praise him. It was a busy court, and this was not in my court, this was in Edinburgh. And the court went silent because they were like, oh my God, this judge is going to tear him to bits. And she said again, sorry? I said, I want you to praise him. And I more or less shouted it. And she said, praise him, I'm going to jail him. And I said, well, you can't jail him, he's under 21, you'll need to get reports. Well, I'm going to remand him. And eventually she relented and let him out. And sure enough, all the things that had said about him were true in the report. I got reports from Aid Abet, I got reports from the Rock Trust, the housing department, to say all of these things that he had done. And 4 weeks later, I went back for his sentencing. And the judge, when I stood up, she said, just sit down. And I thought she was speaking to him, but she was speaking to me. And she spent the next 10 minutes praising that boy. And what the judge doesn't know and didn't see was when we went outside, he said, nobody has ever spoken to me that way. And he left with hope. And that's the bits. It makes me emotional to think about, but that's the bits that I want judges to see, because even a judge could be the person that breaks the cycle. Traditionally, that wouldn't be the case. But if the judge saw that boy's reaction, Kevin knows him. Kevin knows this is going on. He's not cured. It's not the magic wand. But judges have got to persevere. They've got to keep going, because if we don't, and we stop persevering with them, then the reality is that's them written off as young people. There is another thing. I don't wish to hog the limelight, but there's another thing about the Sentencing Council, but we can come on to that if we've got time.
Kevin, just come to you for a second. Founding Aid Abet. First of all, when you hear stories like that, and you obviously know the results, how does that make you feel?
It's all doing it together. I played my part, Iain played his part, the judge played their part, Rock Trust played their part. That's what it's community, that's what it's about. It's all doing my part, and to hear it, and it is emotional because we can see that when there's kindness showed, understanding towards people, it's really powerful.
And for those people who are viewing this, tell me a little bit about Aid Abet and how people can find out more about it.
So there is an Aid Abet website. Aid Abet came about because I was part of the revolving door of prison. I was given tools in prison. See, my story, Gary, is when I was in prison, I was given cognitive behavioural therapy, self-management, recovery training, alcohol and drug awareness. I was given these tools. And then when I came out of prison, so I went in as a heroin addict on a methadone prescription. I left prison non-heroin and non-methadone prescription with a load of tools. I'm guarded to go back into society, and I relapsed in 72 hours because I didn't have somebody to take me through the apprenticeship, go back into society with these tools. I was left with these tools and didn't know how to use them, so I went back to what I knew best. So Aid Abet is basically, prisons are doing what they're doing. As I say, back in the day when I was using piss pots to evolve to I've got a toilet in my cell now, right? And what jails are doing now is they're part of rehabilitation, as part of they're doing a lot of stuff, they're giving tools. Aid Abet's about picking the guys up for the gate and helping these guys sharpen these tools and helping them back into the community and to learn how to live in a way where they don't have to commit crime and get themselves into recovery. And that stuff. So Aid Abet was to prevent the revolving door. Loved experienced mentors who have been through the criminal justice system, who have to speak to them about the people that they engage with, the people who were kind towards them, and how to build better relationships. Because that's what's important is relationships. And some of these people don't have the relationship. And it's about We're just bridges. Aid Abet are just bridges to services, to people, to families again. That's our job. It's a simple process, the connection.
I've got one final question for both you, Kevin, and for Iain in just a moment. Suzanne, listening to the conversation this morning, how much further do you think we need to go? Is there still a long journey to achieve what we need to achieve in this?
Yeah, there's lots of things we need to do. I also want to celebrate how far we have come. So Iain told us a story that he only came across this in 2018. The Resilience film only came to Scotland in 2017. That's what kicked off this national discussion. We have come a long way in a short time. What I don't want is for people to think that this will just happen naturally and it will just progress. It won't. It will only happen because there's a lot of people who push this, that they think it's important, which is why I just want to stress everybody who's come this morning, you matter. You are what will help to create the kind of change that we need. And we know that there are many young people out there who need that, and there are many grown-up people who didn't have the kind of praise that Iain is talking about. We need more kindness and compassion. Somebody said in the chat, have we used that word too often? I don't think we can ever use the word kindness and compassion too often, because it's not something soft. It's actually really, really hard to achieve both in the times in which you have retribution that you could offer. Instead, to opt for curiosity and kindness is a big step. So we've got a long way to go, but we are on our way, and that delights me.
Iain, one bit of advice you'd give others who are trying to change the justice system, and it'll be the same question for Kevin as well.
It's fundamentally a massive system. I think that being made aware of what goes on with childhood trauma, so the adversity in children's lives and the biological effect, the physiological effect that has on someone, then for police and judges and everyone else, lawyers, to understand that, I think they themselves, I think the film itself come up with clever solutions. And I think within the judicial world and the justice system, I think they will start to, when they realise what's going on, they'll come up with clever solutions. So for me, it would be, we've planted seeds of hope. There are things going on very quickly about the Sentencing Council. There is draft guidelines on the Sentencing Council, and they've started to talk about children in care, mental health issues for people under 25. And this is cause for hope, but they don't spell out adverse childhood experiences or childhood trauma, whatever you want to call it. And I would wish people to respond to those guidelines. Consultation period, it finishes on the 21st of August. So I'd ask people to get onto them, read them, they're very short, and to suggest that we go a little bit further and recognise that childhood trauma is something judges must take into account if it is there and relevant for sentencing of young people.
And Kevin, final word to you. I have to say, well, a bit of advice or one piece of advice.
Take risks. I suffer from imposter syndrome. I sometimes feel I shouldn't be part of this, that I'm not good enough, because that's just for the past stuff, that's my PTSD. But I talk about imposter syndrome for me, and there's people out there who might have ideas and thoughts about how can I change, and if we lead for the heart, and we lead for the heart because we care, but sometimes we don't want to say it, or we don't want to confront it, or we don't want to do it. Take a risk, keep risking, and get brave and get strong. Because I mean, for me, I have to grow. Every time I feel that I get imposter syndrome, I've got to break through it and stand up and speak. Sometimes feel like going through this talk of the day. You know, should I really be here on the screen and talking to the audience out there and saying something? And I've got to fight through that. So my key message is take risks for the right people and lead with the heart.
Well, I can only say, sorry, Iain, yes?
Yeah, I'm just going to say, Kevin and I are both from West Lothian. We call people like him and I geysers because we don't believe in ourselves enough. But Kevin's actually a brilliant person, and he's, along with Suzanne and yourselves, have made me brave enough to come and do things like that, because I'm also very uncomfortable doing this. But I know that if I don't do it, probably there's nobody else going to do it. And it's very important. And if you've got a message to say, that Kevin certainly does, I think it's important that we say it, even if we feel a bit daft sometimes when we say it or feel as if we're geysers or imposters. But thanks very much to both of you for letting us on today.
Yeah,
Well, I've got to say, anybody who's brave enough to stand up in front of a judge and say, praise him, gets 10 out of 10 in my book. Suzanne, before we finish, final words.
I just want to say that the two things that Iain and Kevin that you just said are why I was so proud to include you in the book, because you help other people to understand that it takes courage just to tell stories, and knowing that it doesn't look as easy, that it doesn't feel as easy as it may look from the outside, encourages other people to take risks. So I'm just so grateful that you came this morning. Thank you.
And keep following the debate, keep tweeting. Remember, hashtag Tigers and Teddies. We're all here, of course. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for your participation. Kevin and Iain, absolute inspirational stories this morning, stories of bravery. Thank you so much. And even though you don't accept that, but I tell you, believe you me, from a story point of view, and you can tell how this has gone today, because the roller coaster of emotion you can hear, because the story's gone high, low, high, low, high, low, and that is for me the sign of a great chat. We're back on the 22nd of August. We're back in 2 weeks. We're going international. Don't know why I did that accent. Forgive me. Don't know where that came from. We have Dr. Claudia Gould and Dr. Edward Tronick from the USA, and we're talking about the rupture repair cycle, I believe, Suzanne.
Yes, we are, and that will be our last in this series, and I am delighted that we can bring in this topic, which we've not been able to explore in any of the others.
Brilliant. So remember, you'll be able to view this, and remember, share it, please, when it comes out in a couple of days, because this has been a very, very insightful hour. I hope you've enjoyed it. So from me, Gary Robinson in sunny Arbroath, to wherever you are, hopefully it's equally as sunny. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.